So it strikes high achievers more than anybody else. And part of the reason for that is because we are far more likely to experience imposter syndrome when we're stepping outside of our comfort zone.
What I tend to call it is something that's adjacent to a season of loneliness. So you've now kind of outgrown one group and you don't feel like you quite fit into the next group yet.
As an African-American woman, a lot of times being the only person at the table or the only person in the room, I didn't realize that that was one of the things that kind of drove my imposter syndrome. Welcome back to The Unfulfilled Achiever, where we talk about achieving success, but still feeling like something's missing. Hey everyone, I'm Melani Desir, along with my co-host Justin Wendell, and we hope you're enjoying the content we've been providing so far. If so, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel, and also send us some comments and let us know what you think. Today, we're excited. We're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. You've heard us talk about this some or reference it in previous episodes, but we're going to do a deep dive today. So Forbes magazine calls imposter syndrome the psychological phenomenon making people doubt their success. And they say about 70% of people experience it. That's like 3 out of 4 people experience imposter syndrome. So that makes it extremely common. We're super excited to have Kim Meninger today as our guest. She is the host of the Impostor Syndrome Files podcast. She's a leadership coach and consultant, keynote speaker. Check out her TEDx talk, How to Bring Your Diverse Voice to the Workplace. Kim, we're super excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I am so excited to be here.
We want to just start out by having you share a little bit about your journey and how you became passionate about imposter syndrome.
So I will say that I was probably introduced to imposter syndrome a little bit earlier than many because I studied psychology as an undergrad and I learned about it back in the mid-90s. So this was something that was it wasn't out there in the atmosphere in the same way that it is today. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, thank God it's not just me. And then what happened where it really became real for me was I decided not to go into a PhD program in psychology. From the time I was a kid, I always wanted to be a therapist, and I landed in the high-tech world. And there were parts of my role that I really enjoyed, and I liked challenging myself, but I was suddenly surrounded by technical people that to me felt like were speaking a foreign language that I didn't understand. And I was so aware of all that I didn't know. I felt so inadequate compared to the people around me. And I remember thinking, this whole house of cards is going to collapse at any moment. Someone's going to ask me a question and everyone's going to figure out that I do not belong in this room. I do not belong in this organization. And so the chronic stress and anxiety that came with that experience is what led me to then later decide I want to be the resource to others that I wish I had during that time. Because although I knew what it was, I didn't know what to do about it. And a lot of the early quote unquote solutions that I tried were not sustainable. They were not things I would recommend to other people. And so since then, I've decided I really want to normalize this experience. I want to make it feel less like this very destructive force and more like a nuisance. It doesn't fully go away, but we know it when we see it and we have tools readily available to manage it.
That's really interesting, your journey. So you have a background and you were exposed to it a lot early on. I think maybe than most people, you knew what it was, you had a name for it. How did you take that information that you had and turn that into a podcast? Where'd the podcast come from?
Yeah, so I have been talking, one of my signature presentation as a consultant has been around imposter syndrome. And what I found was that 1 hour for a presentation just scratched the surface and people would be left wanting more. And so I'd get a lot of people who would come to me individually for more customized support. And they would always say things to me like, is it just me? Am I the only one who says this? Am I crazy? I'd get some variation of that question over and over again. And finally, I had this aha moment and I thought, you know what? I want to have this conversation publicly. I want to talk to people about their experiences with imposter syndrome so that everybody knows they're not alone. They're not the only ones who feel this way, and that there are things that we can do about it. And so that's why I called it the Imposter Syndrome Files, because it sort of felt like this confidential, secret thing that we were suddenly going to be talking about. And then once people started sharing, then my hope was that it would feel less like there was less of a stigma attached to it, and other people could start sharing too, and that we would all recognize this is not something to be ashamed of. It's just part of the normal human experience.
I think that's extremely important. We talked about some different things on this podcast too, about just creating awareness and starting to get in touch and raising that kind of taboo moniker around these things, and understanding it is part of the day-to-day for a lot of people. It is part of the human experience, and starting to create that awareness and move past it. So I'm also very super excited to have you here, Kim. Very excited to talk about this more and to dig more into your imposter files. So really looking forward to that. And then as you've built this podcast and you've built this group, what are you seeing as you talk to more people? Obviously, you're seeing some of the similar scenarios, people running through it, but I'm guessing it's not locked into one type of group. You're probably seeing it expand across many.
Absolutely. So I think of it as really people in certain situations or from certain backgrounds are more prone to imposter syndrome, but there are a lot of different potential triggers. So it strikes high achievers more than anybody else. And part of the reason for that is because we are far more likely to experience imposter syndrome when we're stepping outside of our comfort zone, right? I often say, if you've been in the same role with no challenges, no surprises for 10 years, there's no reason to feel like an imposter, right? It's when you are stretching yourself and you're suddenly, let's say you're really used to being the highest performer on your team, and then you get promoted to that next level. And now you're comparing yourself in your brand new role to yourself at the peak of your last role. And you're looking around at everybody around you and thinking, how did I get here? Everyone else is so much more experienced. I don't know what I'm doing. And so that is a classic trigger of imposter syndrome, of those transitions and those steps out of our comfort zone. It also tends to strike people who feel different from the dominant culture around them. So the early research on imposter syndrome, and actually for quite some time, was focused exclusively on women. There was an assumption made that only women experience imposter syndrome. And a lot of that is because we see it more often, partly because of, traditionally male dominated work environments, but also to your point, Justin, before we hit record, it's not socially acceptable for men to talk about their own experience with imposter syndrome. So they put on a brave front, and it may manifest differently in men because of the way that we are conditioned gender wise. But there are ways in which, if you feel like you're the only in the room, or you're one of a few, and you look around, the natural tendency is to say, well, I need to be more like them, right? There's something wrong with me, as opposed to thinking that what we bring is different and additive to the mix.
When I mentioned in the beginning that Forbes calls the psychological phenomenon that makes people doubt their success, do you have a similar definition, or what's your definition?
Yeah, the easiest way to define it, from my perspective, is the feeling of being a fraud. Right? It's that sense that even though things are going well, maybe I'm getting great feedback, I'm achieving my goals, on paper, everything looks fine. There's this disconnect internally, and it feels like it's only a matter of time before somebody figures out that I don't actually have what it takes to be successful in this role. That, one false move, right? I get a question I can't answer, or I make a mistake, and everyone's going to realize that I don't belong in this role, in this project, whatever the case may be.
What are some of the common myths that go along with it? One of the things you mentioned was that it's women who experience it, but we know that men do as well. So that's one myth. Are there any others that come to mind?
Well, I think it often gets confused with bigger confidence and self-esteem issues. So imposter syndrome is very specific to how we see ourselves in terms of our competence level typically in the workplace. We might experience this in other areas of our lives as well, but I can be a relatively self-confident person. I can have high self-esteem and still feel like an imposter in certain types of situations. So imposter syndrome is not a chronic state. It's very episodic, very situational. And so we know this from our own personal experience. If we think about it, I could be going through my day and there are going to be times when I have great highs, when I feel perfectly capable of doing what it is that I'm working on. And then I step into a meeting with people who intimidate me and suddenly I'm right back down again into that feeling of self-doubt. So it's not a clinical diagnosis. It's not something that you would be treated for by a mental health professional necessarily, but it does come with a lot of anxiety. It comes with a lot of fear of what happens if someone finds out, or what happens if I make a mistake. So that's why I think that it's important to separate that out from something like a bigger confidence challenge that may require some more, whether that's therapy or longer term kind of support to address.
I think that that's definitely one of the experiences I had. So as coming up the corporate ladder, there was always that period as you went to the next rung where you don't feel like you quite fit. And I actually tie it to entrepreneurial life as well. What I tend to call it is something that's adjacent to a season of loneliness. So you've now kind of outgrown one group and you don't feel like you quite fit into the next group yet. And to me, that imposter syndrome really kicks in those scenarios. So as you kind of keep moving forward, you have to realize that you still bring value. I mean, at least this is what I've seen. I had to teach myself as I still bring value, but now's my time to learn and grow and accept that that's okay. But that's been extremely difficult. And that, to your point, anxiety really manifested in the corporate life because I didn't have those tools. And it got to where I had extreme burnout and even some manifested in some physical health issues. So identifying this is extremely important. It's so impactful for people to realize that this is what they're dealing with and start to get some of the help. I honestly think that, and this is me not being a medical professional, that can also trigger the things of depression and other things that are going on, all those things that can link. And that's why I'm such a firm believer of finding root cause versus treating symptoms. Because if your underlying problem is you don't feel like you fit in or you don't feel like you're worth being in that scenario, that's very different than I have a chemical imbalance that I need treated. So I've experienced some of those challenges as well with medical professionals because they don't think beyond those particular pieces. So I think what you're doing is absolutely critical and needed, especially in the current times where people are kind of trying to figure out where they belong and what's going on and how do I move forward and I have to chase this and everything's anxiety ridden work.
Well, and I really appreciate that perspective because one of the things about imposter syndrome, and there's been a lot of controversy around it recently, is the idea that if you make imposter syndrome more of an individual issue, you're pathologizing that person and not really addressing some of these root causes. And so a lot of what leads to imposter syndrome are the environmental factors around us. And so if we work in an organization or on a team that doesn't have psychological safety, we are that much more anxious about making a mistake or not having the right level of experience because we can expect that there will be some negative consequence to that. Or if we don't feel a sense of inclusion and belonging, there's more of that feeling of, right, I'm different and I'm not accepted for who I am. And so my response to the conversation around, sort of stop talking about imposter syndrome at an individual level is that we absolutely need to be addressing this at the macro level. And that is why I'm a big proponent of raising psychological safety and inclusion. I think we lower imposter syndrome more broadly in doing so, but we also need to address the very real pain that individuals are experiencing on a daily basis. If we just point the finger at a different problem, that one that we don't have a lot of individual control over, then we don't arm people with the awareness and the tools that they need to navigate their everyday environment.
I love your point about people maybe not feeling like they fit in and, that kind of driving an imposter syndrome. As an African-American woman, a lot of times being the only person at the table or the only person in the room, I didn't realize that was one of the things that kind of drove my imposter syndrome. And so hearing that now, it totally makes sense to feel that way. And then I also, similar to what we talked about before, didn't know what it was and why I felt that way. It didn't have a name to it. I just always felt like I need to be doing more, I need to be doing better. I think a part of that also may come into play, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Kim, when we're constantly looking outside ourselves and comparing ourselves to other people and thinking that person knows more than I do, that person is further along than I am, and things of that nature. Is that something that you find in your discussions?
Absolutely. And I often joke that like we all want to feel special, but we don't want to feel different, right? And so when we're sitting there and we're looking around, and this is at the heart of my experience. I'll share a little bit about this too, that when I would sit in these rooms with these engineers and product managers, my assumption was I needed to know what they knew. That because I didn't have the same background, the same education, the same ability to understand the products at the level that they did, that I was deficient in some way. But my role was relationship manager. I managed partnerships with different entities in the ecosystem. And so I was so distracted by all of the things that I didn't know and all of the ways in which I thought everyone around me was so much smarter than I was, that I was neglecting the unique value that I had to bring. And so those of us who do feel different for whatever reason, and it could be something as simple as being the only introvert on a team of extroverts, we bring something special to that room. And if we're so focused on what we don't know, then we are not in a position to share our value. And so sometimes that's a function of the environment and pressure to conform to the norm, in which case I want everybody to ask themselves, am I in an environment that embraces me and where I feel set up to be my best self? But beyond that too, I think it's really recognizing that our attention may be on something that's taking away from where our true value actually lies.
And I think that if I think about leadership, one of the challenges I've seen with different leaders, and even myself coming up the ladder, was feeling I had to know everything. I had to know more than everybody around me. And as I matured, I learned it's the absolute opposite. I need to have a skill to lead and create strategy and develop people, but I needed to hire people that knew more than me. And that was maybe an ego thing or whatever it is, but I've seen so many leaders deal with that. So your point about being in the room with engineers and project managers, you feel you have to know it all. That's not the case. So I love hearing it said more because, again, all these things I've tried to internalize and rationalize and solve myself, even today, feeling I've worked through a lot of it, it's still great to hear, no, this is a normal piece of it. These are what's going on. This is kind of happens in all the different rooms. And I think if you can realize that and recognize that in others, that gives you some additional emotional intelligence to see where you can start to help others back to feeling included, back to creating the safe space. I know Melani's really big on DE&I, all those pieces. It starts to create better work environments. We'd probably have less turnover, less unemployment, all those different things that will help us as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is rooted in our academic experience because it's a real paradigm shift coming out of an academic environment into a workplace. When we're in school, and especially those of us who are high achievers, usually cared a lot about our grades and really appreciated the external validation that we got from that. We're all in the room learning the same thing, and we're all competing with each other for our GPA, for the grades, right? And we're all graded on a standard of perfection. How close to 100 are you getting? And so whether or not you're told by your parents or others that, oh, it doesn't matter if you're perfect, right? You just want to do your best. That's how we're evaluating ourselves. And then we get into the workplace, and now you're surrounded by people who all have different degrees. And we still apply that same mentality of we all need to know everything. And this person's smarter than I am, and I should be prepared. I need to study for every meeting, and I need to memorize every fact. And unfortunately, the workplace is not packaged in learning modules, and you don't get a syllabus, and you don't, so we really don't get a lot of support in making the shift from an environment where there's a lot of structure around what you need to know, and it really is just a matter of how hard do you study, to a place where you're actually rewarded for leveraging the expertise of the people around you. And so for many, it's really driven by ego, to your point, Justin, of like, I don't want someone working for me that knows more than I do, because then what value am I adding? And are they a threat to me in some way. And so instead of appreciating that we each have something different to bring, that feels, it triggers a lot of insecurity.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The insecurity drives that. And we talk a lot about doing the work, being self aware, and being comfortable with who you are. And as leaders, bringing people to the table that have those skills and plugging in the areas where you may be a little bit weak, that takes a lot of strength. And you also need to create a culture where people feel comfortable being able to raise their hand and say, maybe I'm not as strong as another area, and being able to partner them with someone else, or making sure that you have all the right skills on your team, and letting people know you don't need to know everything about everything. That is a culture that needs to be created versus, like you said, feeling like I have to know everything. There's no way. No one can be an expert on everything. So if we make that environment and make that safe space, then people can feel more comfortable with where they are.
Yeah, I truly believe that if we get psychological safety right, which is what you're talking about, right? It's safe for
Yes.
us to be less than perfect. It's safe for us to make mistakes. It's safe for us to ask for help. Then we inherently raise the levels of inclusion as well, because we're not so threatened by each other, because there is space in our brains to be more collaborative and to want to work together and be more compassionate for each other. But when it's an environment where you feel like I'm in survival mode, it's all about me, right? Then I'm not worried about whether I'm being inclusive in this meeting. I'm not thinking about whether I'm being supportive of my colleagues. I'm just thinking about what I need for my own benefit, right? And so the environment, to your point, there's an opportunity for leaders to model this so that everybody gets the message that, oh, okay, I don't need to know this because so-and-so knows this, and we can partner together, and that's not threatening to either one of us.
It's interesting. And I always try to add a little bit of the entrepreneurial side, because we talk about a lot of corporate, obviously Melanie and I did a lot of corporate time, but you still have some of those pieces there. It's very cutthroat. So whatever you're doing, whether it's corporate, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's just even relationships, it's finding that security, I think, is part of the problem or part of the challenge. And but I'm interested to understand, kind of, as you've done this and you've continued to grow in your podcast, your consulting, all those things, how has your vision continued to grow and change? Have you seen new things that have opened new thought processes or new revelations as you've gone through?
Yeah. So one kind of quick thought is we have to stop having this conversation with just women. This is a conversation that happens in every women's group, and that perpetuates the myth that it only applies to women, and it deprives men from opportunities for awareness, support, resources as well. This is a universal human experience. We all need to be part of this conversation. So that is something that became abundantly clear to me over the last few years. Number two is that I think this is really tied to emotional intelligence as well as particularly self-awareness, and really recognizing that so much of what we're talking about here, as I mentioned, anxiety is just a function of our natural human fear response, that when we feel threatened, we go into fight or flight. And when we go into fight or flight, it cuts off our cognitive capabilities, our ability to problem solve and reason. It cuts off our empathy and our ability to connect with one another. And so I think that if my vision and what I would love to focus on going forward is giving people the skills to tame their natural stress response so that they catch themselves before they fuel the fire in a lot of these types of environments. And so if people had the skills to be able to pause long enough to take some deep breaths or rethink the story they're telling themselves, or, just adopt any of the number of tools that are available, that we would all kind of lower the temperature enough that we could get to the kind of place that we're talking about of, oh, I see you less as a threat and more of a resource. But there's so much, you talked about the cutthroat nature of the workplace. There's so much unmanaged stress. I think that what's happening is you're not getting the best of the people around you. You're getting the triggered version of the people around you. And then we're all reacting to each other. So how do we lower that so we can show up differently.
One of the things that we talk about a lot is fulfillment, obviously, is the unfulfilled achiever. So having fulfillment, knowing your passions and finding your purpose. How do you see imposter syndrome impeding someone from having fulfillment and eventually living in their purpose?
Yeah, I think if you're constantly living in fear of being found out, if you're constantly living in fear of making a mistake, if you constantly question whether you're worthy of the opportunities that you've been given, you are not going to feel a sense of fulfillment. You're going to just feel like you're hanging by a thread. And so I think it's really, really important to address imposter syndrome for the very reason that you're talking about, because we all have so much to give, and maybe we're giving it to the wrong people, right? Maybe we're in the wrong environment. And I think that's really important to assess. But if this is a pattern for you and you're moving around to lots of different roles and the same issues keep coming up, then there's probably some good, sort of inner work that you benefit from focusing on too.
That's tough to do. I think you talked about you're realizing it's men as well. For men, we're not allowed to have that experience. We don't have time for that. If you have that problem, you got low testosterone, or you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. So it's interesting to take a step back and say, no, it's okay. It's something that I'm learning about myself, that once I learn it, I can start to overcome it and I can become a better version of myself. I don't need shots. I don't need medicine. I don't need these things. I don't need to just suck it up and rub some dirt on it. Those are all the things that we've been taught. So, as we go through, and I think part of that too is we don't realize what we then project on others.
That's right.
So you see the hostility, the unintended kind of negativity, those things, those are responses to our own fear of our own insecurities or fear of our own shortcomings. So we unintentionally tend to project. So which creates more negativity, creates more challenges and waterfalls. So I think it's very important for the men on this side to take that time and step back and realize it's okay. Everybody has faults. This is part of those things that we go through. I will continue to go through it as I continue to go step up, but I'll have the tools to now deal with it and address it. And I think that's what's important. First identifying, accepting, and then resolving. So, all those things are critically important.
I'm really glad you mentioned that too, because I think that a lot of times women as girls are socialized to internalize a lot of the experience, so are more likely to perhaps experience, that those inner critic kinds of thoughts, where men are more socialized to externally, so that they might snap at other people or get angry, have emotional outbursts. I mean, I worked in a very, very hyper masculine environment for many years, and I saw more men throw temper tantrums than, and women are considered emotional, right? And so I think that when we think about it, this is not about weakness. This is about, if you can become self-aware and recognize that there are tools to manage your own emotional state, that's a form of power. And you think of it as like building muscles, right? In the same way that you would physically, you're stronger as a leader, you're stronger as a human when you have these skills available to you.
Justin, I love you bring your perspective to the table, because as Kim mentioned, you don't hear as many men talk about it. It's really usually the focus on women. In your experience, one, how did you realize you had imposter syndrome? And then two, did you have someone to talk to about it? Are there other men that you've had this conversation with, and how's that been for them?
I'll answer two first. No. Men typically do not have that support network. For whatever it is, it's still taboo. I think a lot of men still aren't there yet. I think part of it too is it's kind of one of those, the dam's ready to break. So they're afraid if they start talking about it, they're not going to shut up. It's going to unlock too many things. They've suppressed too much. So I think there's a challenge there. I know in some of my friend networks, I try to lend the cautionary, hey, if you need talk, you need somebody, I'm here. But even that, it's very cautious on how you bring it forward, because people just see it as a weakness. So I think there's still a lot of problems in the current society around that. And I think what's going to happen, if you look at a lot of the lack of masculinity that's happening, is people have taken on too much. They're now breaking, and they see it as a lack of masculinity. No, it's just those emotions we've tried to overcome with no support for so long that's causing the problems. You look at suicide rate in men versus women, it's significantly higher on men, and that's a lot of part of it. But from the other perspective, from me identifying I hate even bringing this up. It sounds like a brag. So reach to a certain level. You know what I bought? I bought a Lamborghini. I bought my dream car, all those things. I start hanging around other people and I'm like, okay, all these people have multi-million-dollar businesses. They have 9-figure incomes. I don't belong in this group. Why do I even have this car? Or, why do I now talking to these people that have this level of success because I'm not there yet? So I feel like the imposter. I'm like, man, I should just sell my car. I should sell all these things. I don't belong here. In the corporate world, as I went up, it was the same problem. You get to a certain level and you crack into executive and you're like, I'm not an executive. I'm still one of these people back here. I'm still doing this work. This is what I do. I haven't learned these things yet. So it's something I've always had to deal with, but I didn't really realize what the problem was. When I started to recognize it was probably in the last year or two. And it was that car bringing it around, hanging out to people. These individuals are still just individuals. They have their own weaknesses. They have their own hangups. They have their own challenges. And I see imposter syndrome in some of them. Now, some are much better about hiding it than others. But it's a very different world when it comes to the men because we are going to guard it. We're not going to show it. But I realized that I started seeing that. So I've got to start to get over this. And even now, as I've taken this year and a half off and kind of reinventing my life, I question like, okay, where do I belong? What group do I fit in? So I've had to continue to do that work and say, I fit in whatever I attract. So continuing to work on me, I'll continue to attract more people. And I need to realize I'm there for a reason and be okay with that, know my strengths, and continue to work and accept my own challenges.
Where you saw yourself and, moving into different arenas and feeling like I don't belong, it's so interesting because I think a lot of times there's this dichotomy between how we feel and what we think versus how others perceive us. And I get a lot of people saying, oh, you're this or that, or even Justin, you mentioned in our first episode, well, how is Melani experiencing the same thing that I am? Like she's always so well put together. But personally, I didn't feel the same way. So, Kim, I'm sure you've heard this, you've seen this a lot. How do we take the way that we view ourselves and bring it and connect it more to how people see us? Because there's something in how people see us. It's not exactly how we see ourselves. We're probably further along than we think we are. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that we are so aware of every internal thought that we have, and what we see in others is just what they allow us to see. And because there's still such a stigma attached to vulnerability, and especially because men still hold the highest levels of leadership for the most part, we're seeing a representation of success that's very stoic and very strong and seemingly like there's no obstacles that get in the way. And so for us, we're thinking, but I know I made this mistake this morning. I know I don't know this. And we're so aware of all of the internal stuff. And so I think it's important to recognize that every single person, even the most successful leader that you see, unless they're a sociopath, right, has their own insecurities. And the seemingly strongest ones are usually the most insecure because we often confuse strength with people who try to look like they're the smartest people in the room. We confuse that with confidence, when in actuality, if you're really quiet, if you're really confident, that's quiet. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room. If you really believe in yourself, you don't have to prove how smart you are. So I think part of it is recognizing that there's a bias in the way we see ourselves as compared to others, and just reminding ourselves of that at a more conscious level. And also, this is kind of a funny story, but there was this woman that I was talking to once who said she puts these people on pedestals and she goes into these meetings and she thinks everyone's so much smarter than she is and she's not worthy of being in the room. And one day she said, I just decided to get out of my own head for a bit, just really listen to what was going on. And she said, and I realized these people aren't as smart as I thought they were. And I think that's part of it too, is we artificially inflate other people. And it's not to say people aren't worthy or, to start then pointing the finger at other people, but it's more so to kind of balance the scales a little bit and recognize that in the same way that we are artificially inflating other people's value, we're artificially deflating our own value, and that every room that we step into for a reason. And if we need to borrow someone else's confidence for a bit because we're still figuring out what we're doing, then trust that the people around you know you well enough to know that you deserve to be in that room.
I don't know about you, Melanie, but I think when I actually cracked into executive, I had that epiphany. I held everybody on this pedestal. Now I'm like, how did some of these people get here?
They're not very smart.
And there's plenty of smart people, don't get me wrong. But I'll tell you, the leaders, one thing I started to pay a lot of attention as I started getting into EI, the emotional intelligence and those types of things, is watching how leaders lead. The ones that try to hold everything close and control everything, to your point, they didn't have that strength. The ones that wanted to bring people in, wanted to hear, but then gave guidance and try to drive, you almost feel like if you let them down, you're disappointing your parents. Mm-hmm. Those types of leaders, you're like, I want to follow them. And I have some examples that we've gone through. I'm not going to name names, but there were people that have been that way. And they are people I continue to look up to, even though I'm not in that world anymore, because they were just things that they brought to the table that anybody could learn from. But unfortunately, I think the majority are the other side. Yeah. They're they have the insecurity. They're doing everything they can to not look bad. And that creates that negative space for people to work in, which creates a lot of those challenges.
One of the things I'm hearing, and I realized that I did this myself, is reframing how you view things and how you view yourself. And so sitting at the table and maybe having a new challenge or coming into a new role, and like we said, thinking everybody here knows more than I do. And Kim, in your example where your client maybe took her blinders off and said, let me just listen to the people around the table and realize it's not what I thought. I had to do that for myself, just take those glasses off of thinking that everyone else was further than me or knew more than I did or worked harder than I did, and really just started listening and also giving myself credit for what I've done and where I have strengths versus always trying to compare myself to someone else. So Kim, you wear a lot of different hats. You've got the podcast, you're host there, leadership coach, consultant. In your work, what are some of the practical strategies that you give your clients or that you share with people to help them move forward when they realize that they're in some imposter syndrome situation?
Yeah, I think for me, in addition to having struggled with imposter syndrome for so long, I've also always struggled with anxiety. And so I think that the tools that work for anxiety are really good for imposter syndrome as well. So I know personally that when I get anxious about something, I can't solve a problem. I just swirl. It's just in my head and I can't get my arms around it. And so one of the things that I like to do is to break it down and to say, okay, what am I really afraid of right now? Or what is it that I think I don't know enough about? Or really try to boil it down to its component parts, right? So that you can say, okay, well, I do know X, Y, and Z, but what I'm really worried about is that someone's going to ask me a question about this topic. So now what's the solution to that problem, right? Be prepared for what happens if someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to, or see if you can bring an expert into the room with you that you can turn to if you get out of your depth, or, try to brush up on certain areas. And so once you are looking at it through a more analytical lens, as opposed to through this anxiety-based lens, you realize you have more tools and resources available to you than you think you do. But because we're in that fight or flight state, we can't access it. So to be able to kind of think about it ahead of time, one of the things that I often recommend is just spend a week or so noticing what is happening in those moments when you feel this kind of anxiety and self-doubt. What do you notice about the people in the room, the topic at hand, how you personally feel physically and mentally, and make note of that? Because then what it does is it gives you really important data that allows you to better anticipate what's likely to trigger you in the future. And then you have a plan for those triggers. So now you feel more in control of the situation. You can't anticipate everything. But the thing I tell people is everybody measures their value based on expertise. Like, oh, if I'm not the expert in the room, then I'm not worthy of being there. Nobody else expects you to be an expert, right? There are very few experts in the world on anything because information is flowing at such a rapid rate. What we do have, every single one of us, is the ability to learn, the ability to problem solve, and the ability to access resources. If you always stay connected to those three things, if you don't know something, you can figure it out. And I think that gives us the confidence to recognize I may not have all the answers, but I can handle whatever situation comes up.
No, I love that. I think one of the problems I've realized I still have is if I get in that scenario where somebody asks me something I'm not confident in, I can feel myself trying to access a part of my brain that I haven't used or may not have the information. And I'll catch myself either stuttering or kind of trying to put a sentence together. And that's one of those things I still want to really work on. So I think that's great advice, adding some of that preparation. I think repetition too, putting yourself in those scenarios and getting comfortable with the uncomfortable is important. But no, I think that's a great tip.
I have for what you just said about the stumbling, I have 3 very practical tips for that, because in that moment, it almost reinforces our narrative, because when we're in fight or flight, we can't think clearly. We can't speak clearly. And then we think, see, I knew I didn't belong here. I'm fumbling my words. Everyone else is speaking so articulately. So number 1 is take deep breaths. It sends a signal to your brain that it's a false alarm. It starts to move you back to a physiologically neutral state. Number 2, keep a drink with you at all times. It's a perfect pause button. If you start to get flustered, if you feel like you're caught off guard, you take a sip. It buys you time to just kind of come back to neutral. Number 3, speak slowly. The mere act of speaking slowly requires the cognitive part of your brain because it's not an automatic function. And so that once you're speaking slowly, your thoughts aren't racing ahead of you. You feel more in command of your message. People are responding to you accordingly. And there's kind of a virtuous loop there. So I always recommend everyone keep those 3 tips on a sticky note in front of you, because you can't be trusted to strategize in the moment. And then just look at that note and it just brings you back to a more controlled state.
I literally walked through what you said while you were saying it. You said take deep breaths. I started taking deeper breaths. Grounding. Exactly. I looked at my water bottle here. I'm like, okay, here's the water, and to speak more slowly. And that gives you a chance to think about what you're saying versus just rattling anything off. I love those. Those are really practical tips that I am going to put on a sticky and put right here on my computer for the next time. But what you said before, I thought was also really impactful, is to take inventory of what's happening in that moment. What were they talking about that triggered you? What did you feel like you were missing or maybe weren't prepared for, and write that down and make sure that you're ready the next time. I love that. I think having a plan definitely helps with anxiety. That's the whole thing. What if, what if, what if? Well, if you put a plan together and you try to, get around the what if, then that makes you a lot more calm. So if we take the breathing and the water and the speaking slowly and couple it with being prepared and coming up with a plan, I think that makes us feel more confident about where we are and the fact that we should be at the table.
And I think one other thing you mentioned is be comfortable that you're not going to be prepared for everything. So what is your response when you get something else? I think one of the things that drove my anxiety at a point is trying to be prepared for everything. Like, I have to figure this out. I have to figure this out. What if this happens? And I go down every rabbit hole possible. Or just having a default response for something that moves you off.
That's right.
Okay, let me look into that. I haven't had a chance to get into that. And it's okay. And that's one of the things I've had to adopt as well. Accept that I can't know everything. Accept that somebody may ask me a question I'm not ready for, but have something that I can respond with, to be honest, not fumble around and try to make something up on the fly, but then go and find the answer, to your point, being resourceful and being able to find it and then come back and solve it.
That's right. Exactly.
Being honest is huge. I was thinking about that, Justin, being confident enough to say, I don't know the answer, but I will find out. It's okay to not know. And it's okay to say, let me circle back on that, versus trying to make something up on your feet, because people know when you don't know and when you're just saying anything. So I appreciate you bringing that piece up. Stand in your truth and know what you know and be confident about what you know, but also be able to say, I don't know. And next time you will know. So that's those are all good pointers as well.
I'm a terrible liar. It's very obvious if I'm lying. So I just had to kind of accept that. I will say that if your default answer is always, I don't know, I'll go find out, you're not prepared.
That's right.
So do some work on that end.
That's true. Very true. Kim, are there any other points or things that you want to bring up that maybe we didn't touch on about imposter syndrome that you think is important for folks in our community to know?
One thing I think about a lot is that we forget sometimes that we weren't born with all of the skills and capabilities that we have today, that we have been on a continuous learning journey from day one. And so we are the only ones who expect ourselves to have fully mastered something before it even started. So I think sometimes we get so tangled up in the anxiety of the moment that we lose the bigger picture, and to zoom out and just say, you know what? When I left my role, my previous role, I was at the top of my game. But when I started that role, I had very similar insecurities and anxieties too. And look how far I made it. What are some of the tools or resources that I accessed then? And just keep things in perspective. Remind ourselves, we've been here before. Every single one of us has lived to talk about the challenges we've experienced in the past, rather than thinking of this as some big potential for catastrophe. It's just one very small step on a journey we've been on all along.
That's awesome. Thank you. I feel like we've learned so much. I have new tips to take away to help me. And imposter syndrome to me is a journey. So if you know what it is and you feel like you've addressed it, it may pop up again, but Kim's given us several good tips and tricks to help us deal with it. So don't be too hard on yourself as you move along on this journey. We want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your business. We talked about the Imposter Syndrome Files podcast. Talk about where people can listen to the podcast, and also about your leadership coaching and consulting business. Let us know a little bit about that as well.
Thank you so much for asking. The Imposter Syndrome Files is on all the major streaming services like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. So wherever you get your podcasts, you should be able to find it. And when I talk about my leadership coaching, I often describe it as helping people navigate what makes it hard to be human at work, because it addresses this uncomfortable area that is harder to talk about, doesn't get as much attention. So whether it's imposter syndrome or other forms of just performance anxiety, or just, I'm not quite sure how to handle this difficult interpersonal relationship that I have. It's not usually the content of our work that holds us back. It's all of the people-oriented things around it. So I try to help people gather their own toolbox of resources that can help them to navigate those types of challenges in the workplace. So my website is kimmeninger.com if anybody's interested in learning more about that.
And we will link that in the description to make sure you can access to that. And then for the podcast, I'm going to hit you up, Kim, for some of the links too, because we'll get some links out there for people to go straight to your podcast.
Excellent. You guys definitely check out the podcast. I've been listening. Kim has great guests. They talk about really, really good topics. So I think you guys would really benefit from that. And definitely check out her website as well. Well, let's move into the fun part here. We want to ask you some rapid fire questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm just going to throw them out there and just let me know what you think off the top of your head. Morning person or night owl?
Morning person.
That's Justin. I'm a night owl. So you guys are alike in that respect. Coffee or tea?
Neither.
Neither.
Diet Coke.
Interesting.
That's all I do.
Diet Coke. Okay. I was going to say, how do you get that burst in the morning?
Lots of Diet Coke.
Okay. Gotcha. Ketchup in the fridge or in the pantry?
In the fridge. I can see Justin shaking his head.
Who puts it in the pantry?
Me too. In the fridge, the ketchup, when you dip the fry, it has to be cold. I think that's so weird when people eat warm ketchup.
Doesn't it say that to put it refrigerate after opening?
I think it does.
I haven't looked.
I actually read an article.
I think it's like a suggestion. I don't know if you have to.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was funny. Beach vacation or mountain retreat?
Mountain retreat.
When's the last time you had a mountain retreat?
Well, we took our kids out west to a lot of the national parks. We went to see Mount Rushmore. We went to the Badlands. We went to the Grand Canyon. We've seen a lot of the Western landscape, and that is always just so awe-inspiring to me. So
That's awesome. My grandparents took us on a trip like that when I was around 8, and we saw Mount Rushmore. I saw all that stuff. It made what we were seeing and reading in our books and in class so much more interesting.
totally
Just
agree.
seeing things in person makes such a big difference. So kudos to you. Your kids will always remember that. I never forget that trip. Vintage or modern?
Ooh, probably vintage.
Vintage. Yeah. You seem like a classic girl. I think vintage. iPhone or Android?
iPhone. I'm all
Team
Apple.
iPhone.
I'm all Apple everything. So
Justin thinks Apple has this conspiracy. They have us brainwashed. Like when the green bubble pops up when I text somebody, I'm immediately irritated. Like,
That is absolutely a proven thing that they do not use the standard messaging protocol to create that, so more people will want to be iPhones to be included.
yes, and that's smart. It's very smart of them.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
I know that
I have
you
a
feel
fundamental issue.
imposter syndrome for not being an Apple user, Justin,
Absolutely
and we
not.
can work on that.
No, it's more of a superiority complex for not falling into that.
I doubt it. Introvert or extrovert?
extrovert.
We found our extrovert, Justin.
Another extrovert.
Oh my gosh, we got to pick your brains. We're both introverts, and we're always like, what? How do extroverts? We don't understand,
Oh, that's
y'all.
so funny.
We'll take that offline.
Yeah.
We probably have a million questions for you. Text message or phone call?
Text message.
Yeah. Text me first, and then maybe we can
That's
talk
exactly
on
right.
the phone. Yeah. Okay, we're on the same page there.
Mhm.
Two more: audiobook or paperback?
Paperback. I still read I'm probably one of the last people who doesn't have a Kindle, but I read everything in paper.
I don't have a Kindle.
Oh, good.
I also don't read enough, but when I do, I have a book.
But when you do,
I do have some.
I love audiobooks. I agree. Having the book in your hand, turning the page. I'm an avid reader, so I love that. But I can listen to a book while I'm working out, while I'm driving. That's how I kind of got hooked
Yeah.
on audiobooks. So it helps while I'm trying to multitask.
I want to try them just for that reason because I'll get more in.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly why I moved over. Last one: sweet or savory?
Savory.
Savory.
Salt, really.
Yeah,
French
I was
fries.
gonna say this.
Anything salty. Yeah.
Exactly. The salt wins out. Well, Kim, thank you so much for being here. You gave us practical tips. We really enjoyed you. You guys, we hope you enjoy Kim as well. Check her out on her platforms and definitely circle back with us. We're always coming up with great topics for us to talk about. Leave some comments. Let us know what you thought about today's show. Let us know if you tried the tips that Kim mentioned. We want to hear from you guys. And let us know about any other topics that you want us to explore. Until next time, you guys be good. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.